ABC News.
Well, I was only just there. I was in primary school, but yes. Look, it's funny. What I remember of it is that it kind of divided the Beatles fans at the time. There were those who preferred them in their mop-top days and liked the pop songs that they made early in their career, and who couldn't quite accept that they were growing into something much different.
Why was it so special?
Well, look, I mean, to my mind, it isn't the Beatles' best album. I think the two albums that preceded it,
Revolver and Rubber Soul.
Rubber Soul,
yeah, I'm with you there.
More consistent albums in terms of the songs, but it's important to consider the time. You know, the early '67, we're coming into the Summer of Love, and music was already changing quite a lot by then. And even those two albums I mentioned, the Beatles were hinting at, you know, the new directions they were going in with loops and reverse guitars, and so the signs were there that you know, of what was coming with Sgt. Pepper. But I think, you know, conceptually, that's what made it different. You know, the artwork, the songs blending into each other, and it was a hodgepodge of ideas in a way. There was a lot going on, and there are a lot of different influences on that record, from vaudeville and, you know, circus music and all sorts of things going on.
So George Harrison's sitar on the Within Without You, it's got a bit of everything.
Yes, it does. Yes, and that's I think that's what people saw as a change, as a development in pop music. It was quite a leap from what the Beatles had been doing earlier in their career, and of course it influenced a lot of other music that was to come.
It certainly raised it to a level of sort of high art, didn't it? They had the gatefold sleeve that opened out, the lyrics printed in it. It certainly really introduced almost the album effect that sort of dominated the 70s and 80s.
Yes. They thought it through and had a lot of fun with it. And you have to cite George Martin as well, with a lot of credit. I mean, he wasn't the fifth Beatle for nothing, and he was someone who helped them shape Sgt. Pepper, and who, you know, he had two great things going for him, George Martin. It was that he had a great ear and also an open mind, and he was willing to listen to, you know, John and Paul, and to a degree George and Ringo as well, pushing the envelope all the time, wanting to try something new. And that's how we ended up getting something that was quite different.
Quite different indeed, and bringing all of those sort of orchestral elements into play that stayed with the Beatles from beyond that album in 1967, and just getting that orchestra to just go from the bottom note to the top note at the end of Day in the Life, in no necessary kind of a pace or tempo, just all of you start and arrive at the same point by the end, and we'll have this absolute cacophony at the end, and a great way to finish.
Yes, and that very moment, that ending, is one of the most recognisable sounds in the history of pop music.
That's right. What about the other side of the story? I spoke to one of your colleagues earlier today, and he suggested, listen, I don't really like that album much. It's kind of it's excessive, it's overblown, it's artistry overshadowing art.
Look, as I mentioned, I don't think song-wise it's the most consistent album. There are, I mean, When I'm 64 is a bit of a throwaway song, something that Paul wrote and discarded before they even made records. And Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, it was something that John put together after reading a circus poster or something. It's not going to stand as a landmark of John's songwriting, that song. So I think it's, you know, there are some incredible highs on there as well. She's Leaving Home, you know, is one of the best Beatles narrative songs that they ever wrote, and Paul and John wrote together, because by then, of course, they were writing separately as well. And with a little help from my friends, probably the best song that Ringo ever sang.
That's true.
So some incredible highs, but also not just as consistent as Revolver. And it's good to think of it in a slightly larger context. They made those three albums, in the space of 18 months. And that's an incredible achievement. You know, that's like 20 minutes in today's terms of making records.
I think
so that's
go ahead.
It's an
Sorry.
incredible body of work in that space of time.
And packaged pretty well as well. Apparently the packaging was the most expensive to date on the 1967 legendary visuals on the front, which was part of the fun, being able to name all of those many people in that front cover that was spectacular in of itself.
And that locks it into the time as well, all those people that are on the cover.
Amazing stuff indeed. 50 years on, remarkable that in of itself. Dates us all. A new stereo mix of the album being made available, as I said, for Beatles fanatics. They'll buy that again, won't they?
Well, I think they will. I mean, I will certainly listen to it as well. I'm a Beatles tragic, and I'll listen to anything that brings something else to light that we haven't heard.
ABC News. ABC News.
Well, the United Kingdom was a key NATO player in the overthrow of Gaddafi's regime by supporting the rebels against the regime. And of course, at the time, Prime Minister Cameron claimed a major victory, but that intervention was on the basis of a UN resolution which simply legitimized NATO's intervention in Libya. But of course, that was later on disputed by two other members of the Security Council of the United Nations, and that was Russia and China, because they thought that the intervention would be basically to protect the civilians, not to necessarily try to overthrow the Gaddafi regime.
All right, so the questions, I guess, about the motivations of those behind this Manchester Arena attack are running thick and fast. You might need, I guess, any firm direct motivation against the UK if, in fact, this is just all part of a broader Islamic State group or Al-Qaeda effort against the West. How strong is the Islamic State presence in Libya right now?
Well, it is quite really strong. They have had a very strong presence in the northern town of Sirte. Although the Libyan forces claimed in 2016 that they've driven them out from that stronghold, but that does not really seem to be the case. And I think quite a number of Daesh fighters have also moved from Iraq and Syria into Libya, and some people have estimated the presence of their fighters in somewhere around 6,000. We don't have any precise figures, but it seems that both the Daesh and Al-Qaeda have had a strong presence in Libya.
It's been a bit of a political shambles for some time, as I recall. Who's running Libya now after what's been effectively a civil war?
Well, that's not very clear. You've got different centers of powers, and different forces are in control of different parts of the country, and internationally recognized. The government does not have right over most of the country, and the result is that what you really have is a total balkanization of Libya, and there is a civil war going on, and also various outside forces are involved. For example, the Egyptians and the United Arab Emirates have been really bombing different areas, and particularly those areas which are occupied by radical Islamist forces, including the so-called Islamic State. But it seems that these operations have not resulted in containing the civil war which has been raging and causing a lot of disintegration, both politically and territorially, in the country.
ABC News. ABC News.
Well, it's changed since 1967, of course. What it used to say was the only reference to Aboriginal people is to exclude us. In other words, we were never wanted by White Australia when the White Australian policy was around. But in 1967, with such an overwhelming vote of support from the Australian people, they gave the authority to the federal government to change the way Aboriginal people were treated at the state level, and gave the federal parliament power they previously did not have to do things for the benefit of Aboriginal people. So it was in terms of social and political policy, it was a major turnaround. So the only reference now to Aboriginal people in the Australian Constitution is that the federal government has the power to pass laws for all races, including Aboriginal people.
And is there any element of wanting to get rid of that? Isn't that in itself some sort of a racist kind of attitude?
There has been that discussion, especially when the expert panel that was set up by Julia Gillard, I think back in 2010 or 2012, there was a big debate about changing the wording of the power. That hasn't come up much here. I think people are looking more to substantive change so that Aboriginal people get a real chance to take better control of our own affairs. Instead of having cashless welfare cards, which punish Aboriginal people who drink too much or on substance abuse, give those communities the authority and the resources and the tools so that they can look after those people and treat the issue as a health matter, not as a Centrelink matter. So there's been a shift away from focusing on tweaking the Australian constitutional provisions and the race powers to saying, look, those things are all part of the discussion and they are important, but let's try to get some benefit to the people out of this summit by Friday afternoon.
And how confident are you that a single question will emerge by Friday afternoon?
Well, people are working very hard, and I could not have been more pleased about the development of ideas in the last, 2 days, because after day one, I and others were a little bit depressed, thinking, oh, gee, this is going to be a tough ask to get 250 people to resolve all of these matters down to a single issue, which is your point. We are nearly there, and I don't know what the answer will be that will come out of the summit, but people have focused the discussion now down to almost one or two issues. So it's looking good. I think that whatever comes out of this is capable of being adopted by the Australian people and Australian governments, and if they did, the real beneficiaries will be Aboriginal people.
I'm interested that you say that, because that's the next major hurdle, isn't it? Because whatever comes out of this meeting does have to be put to the broader Australian public, and it's got to be palatable to an overwhelming majority.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the options, Tracy. If we go down the path of any practical advancement for Aboriginal people is linked necessarily to a referendum, then the majority of the people in the majority of the states has to vote on it. The alternative is to say, well, look, it depends on what it is we're asking for. That there's been a lot of discussion about reconstituting a national Aboriginal body that has its own resources, that can take priority, determine priorities and fund Aboriginal programs in accordance with the wishes of Aboriginal people. Now, it hasn't been resolved whether the means by which such a body would come about is linked to the referendum outcome, or whether that can be simply set up through legislation. But what is clear so far is that all people in all delegates seem to be saying, well, we definitely have to have a national Aboriginal body that has been denied us since John Howard shut down ATSI.
And so what about the discussion of treaty, which I think is one of the things you are more supportive of? How prominent is that going to be in what emerges tomorrow?
Treaty has been a prominent discussion. Treaty and constitutional recognition and a national body have been the three key issues. Yes, I am a strong advocate of a treaty because I believe that Australia should be having a large and significant package settlement with Aboriginal people that gives us land, empowerment, a guaranteed source of revenue, and gives us the ability to plan for the futures of our communities instead of having to go cap in hand to a white minister every 6 months. But at the same time, I'm conscious that I am only one delegate, and if a treaty does not get up, or if some other position gets up, and it might fall short of my expectations, I've told the conference that I will back that outcome, and I will endorse that outcome and do everything I can to bring that about. So my views are not that important. The important thing here is to get consensus or some common ground among 250 people, and we're doing a pretty damn good job so far.
Well, it sounds like everyone's really coming together to make sure they're part of the solution rather than continue to put up potential problems.
I think the biggest advantage out of this, Tracy, is that for the first time since Eva Valley, where we had to come together to make a response to the Mabo decision in 1992, this is the largest gathering of Aboriginal people since that time. So that was 25 years ago. And people have grasped the very limited opportunity that we get nowadays to come together, and people are taking responsibility for making sure we come up with something that will give hope to our people, leadership to all of our supporters around the country, and give something to the politicians that, if they agreed to it, would make a real difference to the lives of Aboriginal people. And for that reason, I think that everybody's on a bit of a high, because both the government and the opposition and the Greens have endorsed this process, which means they should endorse, if we put things to them that are within reach, the outcome of this meeting. Because otherwise it's tantamount to saying we will only support things that come out of a national meeting if you tell us the things we want to hear. Now, that is not a good process, and that is not proper consultation.
ABC News.
ABC News Radio.
The BioPen is a 3D printer, so I'm sure that many people now are starting to be comfortable with the concept of 3D printing, but usually they're pretty big machines. So this instead is a 3D printer that can actually be held in your hands, and is a surgical printer, so the surgeon can actually use that in surgery. And the ink is made of the cells of that patient, so stem cells that can make cartilage, together with a special biomaterial, which is a hydrogel. So together, the printing will create new tissue, in this case cartilage.
How was the pen developed?
Well, that was a fantastic idea that started from talking between a clinician, Professor Chung, and a researcher, Professor Wallace, and that's where the best ideas for the treatment of human diseases can actually come from, when the scientist meets the clinician. So that came about 4 or 5 years ago as an idea, and then bringing the expertise together. The concept of the BioPen came out, and I was lucky enough to be the first one to try that.
I believe the BioPen has had promising results on sheep. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah, that's correct. So obviously we started with in vitro experiments, and then when we started to have the first good results, we did a pilot study. So the goal of this pilot study was mainly to test the applicability of this technology in a mock clinical situation, surgical situation, and the results were extremely good. But what we weren't expecting was actually that also the tissue that we regenerated was much better than the one that instead gets formed if we use the standard surgical techniques. So it was extremely exciting, and now this work has been recently published in a high impact factor journal in tissue engineering, so we're very excited about that too.
What kind of injuries will be most effective in treating in humans?
That would be young patients, so for example athletes or people that have a articular injury, so an injury in the cartilage in the joint, not necessarily the meniscus or the ligaments, but the proper lining of the joint. And so there are injuries that at the moment cannot be successfully treated and inevitably drive to osteoarthritis, which is a degenerative change of the joint. So we aim at target at the moment these niche of patients to prevent the development of arthritis in this group, which also would have arthritis much earlier than the normal population, the standard population. So that's the beginning, and then hopefully in the future we can expand this technique to more patient and more broad indications.
Is this BioPen a world first?
It is. It's a world first surgical handheld bioprinter. Yes, it is.
And obviously the international medical community will be watching this closely.
Yes, well, it's been presented already in many international conferences in tissue engineering. So there are different devices around, but nothing that can actually be used by the surgeon at the time of surgery for this type of application.
For anyone who'd like to be involved in the trial, what should they do?
At the moment, be patient, unfortunately, because we are optimizing the device. We are working with the industry to start having a device that is actually reliable, because obviously this 3D printer is actually 3D printed at the moment, so it's a prototype. Once we have the first very reliable results, that's when we think that we can really make a change. So it's going to be about a year time.
abc.net.au/newsradio. Get your news now. ABC News Radio.
So the President's budget request is not, in fact, about reform. It's a package of just enormous cuts that target a very wide range of Americans: children, parents, working people, seniors, people with disabilities. And they're used, this wide range of cuts in healthcare, in nutrition, in programs that help low-income students go to college, in childcare, really across the whole range of what government does in education, health, nutrition, are there in order to finance tax cuts for the very rich. So a couple of examples. In healthcare, I don't know if people in Australia have been following, but the United States under the previous president finally passed a broad healthcare plan called the Affordable Care Act, and President Trump and the Republican Congress have been trying to repeal it. And the plan that just has passed one of our two houses, the neutral Congressional Budget Office, said that it would toss about 23 million people off of health care coverage. So the president's budget, which is what we're talking about here, assumes all of those reductions and then adds $600 billion of further cuts to a program called Medicaid, which is our core health program for a wide range of working and low-income people. It helps almost 40% of children get their coverage from Medicaid, and the budget also proposes to cut the other children's health insurance programs. So in total, it attacks the programs that provide health coverage for about half of children, seniors, a lot of low-income working adults, people in low-wage jobs. So that's a big example. Our national program that provides a floor on food, on nutrition assistance, is another target. The budget proposes to go back decades to before we had a national floor for nutrition. And again, despite the language that you quoted about welfare or about people who aren't working, that's also a program that is about the people getting help are about half children. Many are low-wage workers whose jobs aren't sufficient to make ends meet, seniors. So there's a very broad array of cuts to the whole range of what government does for ordinary people in order to finance tax cuts for corporations and the wealthiest.
Would you say the president is inadvertently targeting his own supporter base of marginalised white Americans?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I don't think I know enough about the motivations to be able to say inadvertently, deliberately, or what the reasons are. The budget director, Mr. Mulvaney, has certainly, when he was in the Congress, has had many of these ideas, which I think we would say are much more extreme than what the large majority of Americans hold. But I think it's absolutely right that those targeted are a very broad range of Americans working in low-wage jobs, unemployed, older people, people with chronic illnesses, and that what we hope will slow down work on this will be very broad reaction to it.
Are there many people on welfare and disability payments who are taking advantage of the system over there?
No, we really primarily have the other problem, which is that we're getting help to far too few people. whether it's health insurance, where, as I said, we've made progress, but the risk is of losing millions of people off of it, or the other kinds of help, child care help, paying for child care for low-income working people gets to about 1 in 6 people right now, so it's not something you want to roll backwards. And I would say the president's proposals to that include the idea of focusing more on work generally fly in the face of the evidence that people getting this help often are working, but the problem is low-wage jobs and a labor market where people who want to work full-time often can't. So I think the evidence is against the proposals, not with them.
How likely do you think it is that the changes to the social welfare programs will become law? How much opposition is there to it?
I think it's hard to predict right now. There's certainly, the Congress will be looking at the health care bill and at the budget over the summer, and the budget certainly into the fall. We've seen with the health care bill an enormous public opposition, which led our House of Representatives first to be unable to pass it, but then they did pass it. I think the risk here is that some of these ideas have been held by people within the Congress, within the House of Representatives for a long time. So I think it's very important that there's a lot of response by a wide range of people in members' districts. And I think if that response continues very intense, I hope people will see the budget for what it is, which is an assault on really what government does that provides opportunities for ordinary people. Just one more example. The budget proposes large cuts in all the ways that our federal government helps low-income college students be able to afford college. So the program called Federal Work-Study Program, of course, about working and helping you pay for college, subsidized student loans, other kinds of initiatives. And I don't think there's any way to see those as about laziness. They're the opposite. They're about being ready to do whatever you need to do to get that credential that will help you move up on the job. And so there's not a sensible philosophy behind these changes. They're about cutting this whole range of ways that government helps ordinary people.
abc.net.au/newsradio. Get your news now.